The screams echoed through the stone corridors of St. Cecilia's convent at 3 in the morning. Sister Agnes pressed her trembling hands against the cold wall, listening to sounds that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Behind the locked door of the discipline chamber, something unspeakable was happening to Sister Maria. But what drove a community of devout women to commit acts so horrific that even seasoned detectives would struggle to speak about them? The answer lies in a twisted interpretation of faith, a charismatic leader's descent into madness, and a young nun's desperate attempt to escape a nightmare disguised as holy ground. Sister Maria Vittoria arrived at St. Cecilia's convent in the autumn of 1957, her heart full of devotion and her mind set on serving God. The 23-year-old novice had grown up in a small village in northern Italy, the youngest daughter of a farmer who could barely afford to feed his 7 children. The convent represented not just spiritual fulfillment, but also security, a place where she could dedicate herself to something greater than the grinding poverty of her childhood. She had no way of knowing that she was walking into what would become one of the most disturbing cases in Italian criminal history. The convent itself sat perched on a hillside overlooking the town of Prato, a medieval structure with thick walls that had witnessed centuries of prayer and penance. To the townspeople below, it represented tradition and spiritual authority. The nuns rarely ventured into town, maintaining a cloistered existence that locals respected and admired. But what was really happening behind those ancient walls? What secrets were buried in the shadows of those long corridors? Mother Superior Juliana had ruled St. Cecilia's for nearly 15 years by the time Maria arrived. At first glance, she appeared to be the embodiment of religious devotion. 62 years old with sharp features and piercing gray eyes, she commanded immediate respect from her sisters. She spoke often of sacrifice, of purification through suffering, of the need to mortify the flesh to elevate the spirit. Her interpretation of monastic discipline was severe, but the 28 nuns under her authority had learned never to question her methods. Those who did face consequences that went far beyond traditional penance. Sister Maria's first weeks at the convent seemed normal enough. She rose at 4:30 each morning for lauds, spent her days in prayer, study, and manual labor, and retired to her small cell each night exhausted but content. She worked in the convent garden alongside Sister Agnes, a 40-year-old woman who had taken her vows 2 decades earlier. Agnes rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried a warning that Maria didn't yet understand. "Keep your head down," Agnes whispered one morning as they pulled weeds from between rows of vegetables. "Never draw attention to yourself. Never question Mother Superior, no matter what you see or hear." Maria laughed nervously. "I'm here to serve God. Why would I question anything?" Agnes's weathered hands stopped moving. She glanced toward the convent building, then back at Maria. "Because sometimes what happens here has nothing to do with God." Before Maria could ask what she meant, Sister Bernadette appeared at the garden gate, her face stern. "Sister Agnes, Mother Superior wants to see you immediately." The color drained from Agnes's face. She stood slowly, wiping dirt from her hands onto her habit. As she walked toward the convent, Maria noticed her shoulders were shaking. What could possibly terrify a woman who had dedicated her entire adult life to this place? That night, Maria heard the screams for the first time. They came from somewhere deep within the building, muffled by stone and distance, but unmistakable in their agony. She sat up in her narrow bed, her heart pounding. Should she investigate? Should she call for help? But who would she call? The other nuns must be hearing this too. Yet no one was doing anything. The screaming continued for what felt like hours, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. The next morning at breakfast, Sister Agnes was absent. When Maria quietly asked Sister Bernadette where she was, the older nun's expression hardened. "Sister Agnes is in seclusion, doing penance for her sins of pride and disobedience. We do not speak of those who are being corrected. But what sins could possibly warrant the sounds Maria had heard? What kind of penance required such suffering?" She wanted to ask more questions, but remembered Agnes's warning about keeping her head down. 3 days later, Sister Agnes returned to the common areas. She moved slowly as if every step caused pain. Her face was pale, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. When she bent to pick up her prayer book, Maria saw angry red marks on her wrists, barely hidden by her sleeves. Burns, Maria realized with horror. Those were burns. "Sister Agnes, what happened to you?" Maria whispered during evening prayers when they happened to be kneeling side by side. Agnes's lips barely moved. "I questioned Mother Superior's methods. I suggested that perhaps some of our practices were too harsh. I was wrong to doubt her wisdom. She helped me see the error of my ways. The words sounded rehearsed, mechanical, as if Agnes had been forced to repeat them until they became automatic. But her eyes told a different story. They were filled with a terror so deep that Maria felt it in her own chest. The turning point came on a cold November evening when Mother Superior summoned all the nuns to the chapter house for a special meeting. She stood before them, her black habit making her look like a harbinger of darkness in the candlelight. "Sisters, we live in troubled times," she began, her voice resonating off the stone walls. "The world outside these walls grows more corrupt with each passing day. The church itself has grown soft, compromising with modernity, forgetting the true meaning of sacrifice and devotion. Here at St. Cecilia's, we must hold firm to the old ways. We must be willing to suffer as Christ suffered, to purify ourselves through pain and submission." The nuns murmured their agreement, but Maria noticed several women who kept their heads bowed, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. Mother Superior continued, her voice rising with passion. "Some among us have shown weakness. They have questioned divine authority as it flows through me to you. They have allowed doubt to poison their faith. Tonight we will witness what happens to those who stray from the path of righteousness." Two large nuns Maria didn't recognize well dragged a younger sister into the room. Sister Francesca was barely 20 years old, her face streaked with tears. She was struggling against her captors, but seemed too weak to break free. Sister Francesca was caught with a letter, Mother Superior announced, holding up a folded piece of paper. "A letter to her family, complaining about our way of life, questioning our practices, begging to be allowed to leave. She has broken her vow of obedience. She has shown contempt for God's plan for her life. What should be her punishment?" The room fell silent. Maria felt sick to her stomach. What kind of punishment could be appropriate for writing a letter? "She will receive 20 lashes, Mother Superior declared, and you will all watch so that you understand the consequences of disobedience." What happened next would be seared into Maria's memory forever. Sister Francesca was forced to her knees, her habit pulled down to expose her back. Mother Superior wielded the instrument of punishment herself, a leather strap reinforced with wire. The sound of it striking flesh echoed through the chamber like gunshots. Francesca's screams filled the space, primal and desperate. Some nuns looked away. Others watched with expressions that ranged from horror to something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. Maria wanted to intervene, wanted to scream for this madness to stop, but fear paralyzed her. She had been at the convent for less than 2 months. She had no authority, no power, no allies. If she spoke up, she would be next. So she stood there, trembling and silent, as a young woman was brutally beaten in the name of God. When it was over, Sister Francesca lay motionless on the floor, her back a mass of bleeding welts. Mother Superior stood over her, breathing heavily from the exertion. "Take her to the infirmary," she commanded, "and let this be a lesson to all of you. Disobedience will not be tolerated. Weakness will not be tolerated. This is how we achieve spiritual perfection." That night, Maria made a decision. She would find a way to leave the convent. She would wait for an opportunity, any opportunity, to escape this nightmare. But escaping a cloistered convent wasn't like walking out of a job. She had taken preliminary vows. Her family believed she was living a holy life. If she simply disappeared, where would she go? Who would believe her stories about what was happening behind these walls? The winter months brought new horrors. Mother Superior's punishments became more frequent and more severe. Sister Helena was locked in a windowless cell for 2 weeks because she had been seen smiling during prayers. Sister Benedetta was forced to kneel on dried peas for 8 hours because she had burned the soup. Sister Catherine was subjected to ice-cold baths in the dead of winter because she had questioned whether their morning prayers needed to be quite so early. But the worst was reserved for those whom Mother Superior suspected of planning to leave or of discussing the convent's practices with anyone outside. These unfortunate women disappeared into what the nuns whispered about as the discipline chamber, a room in the oldest part of the convent that had once been used for storing wine. What happened in that room was the subject of terrified speculation. Those who emerged from it were changed, broken in ways that went beyond physical injury. Sister Maria tried to keep her head down, tried to be invisible, but she couldn't stop thinking about escape. She began to observe the convent's routines more carefully. The doors were always locked from the inside, keys kept on a ring that Mother Superior wore at her waist. The windows were either too high or too narrow to climb through. The only regular contact with the outside world came when Father Domenico visited once a month to hear confessions and celebrate Mass. In March of 1958, Maria saw her chance. Father Domenico was an elderly priest, nearly 70, who seemed to sleepwalk through his duties at the convent, but he represented a connection to the outside world, someone who could potentially help. During her confession, Maria took a deep breath and made her move. "Father, I need to tell you something that isn't exactly a sin, but I don't know where else to turn," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Speak, my child," Father Domenico replied, his voice tired and disinterested. "Things are happening here that aren't right. Mother Superior is hurting the sisters. Not discipline, Father, but real torture. I've seen women beaten until they couldn't walk. I've heard screams in the night that make my blood run cold. This isn't about spiritual growth. This is about cruelty and control." There was a long silence from the other side of the confessional screen. When Father Domenico finally spoke, his voice was cold. "Sister Maria, you are very young and very new to religious life. What seems harsh to you is simply the ancient tradition of monastic discipline. Mother Superior Juliana is a woman of great faith and experience. To question her authority is to question God's will. I suggest you pray for humility and obedience." Maria felt as if she'd been struck. "But Father, you don't understand. Sister Francesca can barely walk. Sister Agnes has burn marks on her wrists. Something terrible is going to happen if someone doesn't stop this." "Enough!" Father Domenico's voice was sharp now. "You will not spread these malicious rumors. I will be speaking with Mother Superior about your attitude. Now pray 3 rosaries for the sin of bearing false witness and pray that God forgives your wickedness." Maria stumbled out of the confessional, her last hope crushed. Father Domenico not only didn't believe her, he was going to tell Mother Superior about her complaints. She had just sealed her own fate. That evening, Mother Superior summoned Maria to her private office. The room was austere, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a large crucifix on the wall. Mother Superior sat behind the desk, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. "Sit down, Sister Maria," she said quietly. Maria sat, her hands trembling in her lap. "Father Domenico told me about your confession today. He's very concerned about your state of mind. He thinks you may be suffering from some kind of nervous condition, seeing things that aren't there, imagining cruelties that don't exist." Mother Superior's voice was gentle, almost maternal, which made it somehow more frightening. "I told him that you're simply young and finding the adjustment to religious life difficult, but I'm beginning to wonder if I was too generous in my assessment." "Mother Superior, I only wanted—" "Silence!" The gentleness vanished, replaced by cold fury. "You wanted to betray your sisters. You wanted to bring scandal upon this holy house. You wanted to destroy everything we've built here because you lack the strength and commitment to live up to your vows." "No, that's not—" Mother Superior stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "You will learn obedience, Sister Maria. You will learn it the same way the others have learned it. Take her to the discipline chamber." The 2 large nuns appeared as if they'd been waiting outside the door. They grabbed Maria by the arms and began dragging her down the corridor. She screamed for help, pleaded for mercy, struggled against their iron grip, but no one came to her aid. The other nuns simply closed their doors, turned away, pretended not to hear. The discipline chamber was worse than Maria had imagined. It was a small, cold room with walls that seemed to absorb sound. There were instruments hanging on the walls that looked like they belonged in a medieval torture museum. Chains, whips, strange metal devices whose purpose Maria didn't want to contemplate. A wooden chair sat in the center of the room, fitted with leather straps on the arms and legs. "Strip her and bind her," Mother Superior commanded, following them into the room. Maria fought with everything she had, but she was no match for the 2 strong women. They tore off her habit, leaving her in only her thin undergarments, then forced her into the chair. The leather straps bit into her wrists and ankles as they were tightened. She was completely immobilized, completely vulnerable. Mother Superior approached slowly, picking up various instruments and examining them as if deciding which to use first. "The problem with young sisters like you," she said conversationally, "is that you come here thinking religious life will be easy. You think you'll spend your days praying and gardening and feeling holy. You don't understand that true spiritual growth requires suffering. The body must be broken before the soul can soar." She selected a thin wooden rod, flexible and cruel-looking. "We'll start with something simple. 20 strokes. If you scream, we add 10 more. If you beg, we add 20. If you blaspheme, we continue until dawn. Do you understand? Maria tried to be brave, tried to stay silent, but the first stroke across her bare shoulders shattered her resolve. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a searing agony that seemed to spread through her entire body. By the 5th stroke, she was screaming. By the 10th, she was begging. By the 20th, she was barely conscious. But Mother Superior wasn't finished. "You tried to betray us," she hissed, her face close to Maria's. "You tried to bring the authorities down on this sacred place. For that, you need a permanent reminder of your failure." What happened next would mark Maria forever. Mother Superior heated a metal brand over a candle flame until it glowed red, then pressed it against Maria's inner forearm. The smell of burning flesh filled the small room. Maria's scream was so loud, so filled with pure agony, that even the 2 nuns assisting looked uncomfortable. When they finally released her from the chair, Maria collapsed to the floor, unable to stand. She was dragged back to her cell and locked inside. For 3 days she lay on her narrow bed, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body a map of pain. No one came to help her. No one brought medicine or bandages. She was left to heal or die on her own. But Maria didn't die. Despite everything, some stubborn core of survival kept her alive. When she finally emerged from her cell, gaunt and hollow-eyed, she had changed. The bright-eyed novice who had arrived full of faith and hope was gone. In her place was a young woman who understood true evil, who had learned that cruelty could wear the mask of righteousness. The other nuns treated her differently now. Some looked at her with pity, others with a kind of grim recognition. She had joined their ranks, the ranks of the broken. Sister Agnes approached her during garden duty one morning in April. "I'm sorry," Agnes whispered. "I should have warned you more clearly. I should have told you that trying to get help only makes it worse." "How long has this been going on?" Maria asked, her voice rough from disuse. Agnes looked at the spring sky as if calculating. "Mother Superior has always been strict, but it got worse about 5 years ago. That's when Sister Margarita tried to leave. Mother Superior convinced the girl's family that she had become mentally unstable, that leaving would be the worst thing for her. The family trusted her, sent Margarita back. What Mother Superior did to her as punishment?" Agnes shuddered. "Margarita never recovered. She's in the infirmary now, completely unresponsive. Has been for 3 years. Why hasn't anyone reported this? Why hasn't anyone gone to the police? And tell them what? That a Mother Superior is too strict with her nuns? That religious discipline sometimes hurts? The church protects its own, Maria. And most people believe that what happens in a convent is between the nuns and God. Besides, who would believe us? We're cloistered nuns. We never leave these walls. We have no contact with the outside world except through Mother Superior and Father Domenico, and he's completely under her spell." Maria felt despair settling over her like a shroud. "So we're trapped here, forever." Agnes gripped her hand, the first kind physical contact Maria had experienced in months. "Not forever. Someday something will change. Someone will see through her. We just have to survive until then." But surviving became increasingly difficult as Mother Superior's behavior grew more erratic and her punishments more severe. In May, Sister Benedetta was subjected to waterboarding because she had spilled communion wine during Mass. In June, Sister Teresa was beaten so badly she lost hearing in her left ear because she had received a birthday card from her mother that Mother Superior deemed too affectionate and worldly. In July, Sister Francesca, the young nun who had been punished for writing a letter months earlier, simply disappeared. When Maria asked about her, Sister Bernadette said only, "Sister Francesca has been transferred to another convent." But her voice trembled as she said it, and her eyes wouldn't meet Maria's. The truth came out 2 weeks later when Sister Agnes, driven by guilt and grief, whispered to Maria during night prayers, "She's not at another convent. She's buried in the old cemetery at the edge of the property. I saw them carrying her body there late one night. I watched through my window as Mother Superior and 2 others dug the grave." Maria felt the blood drain from her face. "Are you saying she's dead? That Mother Superior killed her?" "I'm saying that Francesca wouldn't stop begging to leave. She became hysterical, screaming at all hours, trying to break down doors. Mother Superior said she was possessed by demons, that she needed special treatment. They took her to the discipline chamber and..." Agnes's voice broke. "The screaming went on for hours, Maria, and then it stopped, and then I saw them burying her. This was no longer just abuse. This was murder. And if Sister Francesca had been killed, how many others had met the same fate? How many bodies were buried in that old cemetery under markers that read "died in service to God"? Maria knew she had to escape, not just for her own survival, but because someone had to tell the world what was happening at St. Cecilia's Convent. But how? The place was locked tighter than a prison. The doors were always secured. The windows were inaccessible. And even if she somehow got out, where would she go with no money, no identification, dressed in a nun's habit? The opportunity came in August, during the Feast of the Assumption. The convent hosted a small celebration, and a few local benefactors were invited to attend Mass and share a meal afterward. It was the one day of the year when outsiders actually entered the convent grounds, when doors were unlocked and vigilance was slightly relaxed because Mother Superior wanted to project an image of peaceful religious devotion. Maria planned carefully. She stole a simple dress from the laundry, clothes that had been donated to the convent for their charity work. She hid the dress under her mattress. On the morning of the feast, she volunteered to help serve the meal, knowing it would give her access to the main dining area where the guests would be. During the meal, while everyone was distracted by food and conversation, Maria slipped away. She ran to her cell, changed into the dress, and headed for the main entrance. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. At any moment, someone might see her. At any moment, Mother Superior might realize she was missing. The front door was unlocked, standing open to allow the summer breeze to flow through the building. Maria walked through it, forcing herself not to run, not to draw attention. She crossed the courtyard, passed through the gate, and started down the hill toward town. Every step felt like it might be her last, like a hand might grab her shoulder and drag her back into hell. But no hand came. No one shouted for her to stop. She kept walking faster now, her bare feet finding purchase on the rough stone path. By the time she reached the edge of town, she was running, tears streaming down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst into the local police station like a woman possessed, startling the two officers who were playing cards at the desk. "Please," she gasped. "Please, you have to help me. I've escaped from St. Cecilia's Convent. They're killing people up there. They killed Sister Francesca. They torture the nuns. Please, you have to believe me." The officers exchanged glances. One of them stood slowly, approaching Maria with the kind of caution normally reserved for handling dangerous animals. "Calm down, sister. Let's start from the beginning. You say you're from the convent?" Maria nodded frantically. "Yes, I was a novice there, but it's not a convent, it's a prison. Mother Superior, she tortures people. She murdered Sister Francesca. There's a body buried in the old cemetery. You have to investigate. You have to stop her before she kills anyone else." The other officer had picked up the telephone. "I'll call Father Domenico. He can sort this out." "No!" Maria lunged forward. "Father Domenico knows what's happening, and he doesn't care. He's part of it. You can't trust him. You have to go to the convent now, before they have time to hide the evidence." But the officers were already treating her like an escaped mental patient, rather than a credible witness. They spoke to her in soothing tones, offered her water, asked her to sit down and rest. Within 30 minutes, Father Domenico arrived, his face a mask of concern and disappointment. "Sister Maria," he said gently, "Mother Superior told me you've been struggling with your mental health. She's very worried about you. Let's get you back to the convent where you can receive proper care." "I'm not crazy," Maria screamed. "Everything I'm saying is true. Check the cemetery. Investigate the discipline chamber. Interview the other nuns privately, away from Mother Superior. They'll tell you the truth if they're not afraid of being punished." But her desperation only made her seem more unstable. The officers, reluctant to interfere in church matters and influenced by Father Domenico's calm authority, agreed to escort her back to the convent. Maria fought them every step of the way, screaming warnings, begging them to listen, but they simply held her arms more tightly and pushed her forward. Mother Superior was waiting at the convent entrance, her expression sorrowful. "Thank you so much for bringing her back," she told the officers. "Sister Maria has been having delusions for months. We've been praying for her recovery. We'll make sure she receives the care she needs." As the officers turned to leave, Maria made one last desperate attempt. "She's going to kill me. Please don't leave me here. Check the cemetery. Please just check the cemetery." But the officers were already walking away, eager to be done with this uncomfortable situation. Father Domenico followed them, shaking his head sadly at the tragedy of a young woman's mental breakdown. Mother Superior's sorrowful expression vanished the moment they were gone. Her face twisted into something inhuman, something monstrous. "You stupid, stupid girl," she hissed. "Did you really think you could escape? Did you really think anyone would believe you over me?" She turned to the two large nuns who were always nearby when violence was needed. "Take her to the discipline chamber. We'll make sure she never causes problems again." What happened to Sister Maria over the next 3 days would later be described by forensic experts as some of the most severe torture they had ever documented. She was beaten, burned, starved, and subjected to psychological torments designed to break her mind as well as her body. Mother Superior visited regularly, sometimes to inflict more pain, sometimes simply to watch and lecture about the price of disobedience. By the third night, Maria was barely conscious. Her body was covered in injuries, some of which would never fully heal. She had stopped screaming hours ago, stopped begging even longer ago. She existed in a gray space between life and death, aware of pain but too exhausted to react to it anymore. But fate, or providence, or simply random chance intervened. Sister Agnes, consumed by guilt over her failure to help Sister Francesca and terrified that Maria was suffering the same fate, did something unprecedented. She stole the keys from Mother Superior's chamber while the older woman slept, unlocked the discipline chamber, and found Maria unconscious and barely breathing. Agnes made a decision that would save Maria's life but end her own. She couldn't carry Maria down the hill to town, couldn't risk the time it would take. Instead, she dragged her to the wall at the edge of the property and pushed her over. It was a 6-foot drop into bushes on the other side, painful but survivable. Then Agnes ran down the hill herself, her old legs carrying her faster than they had moved in years, and pounded on the door of the first house she reached. "Help!" she screamed. "There's an injured woman outside the convent walls. Call an ambulance. Call the police. There's been a terrible accident." By the time Mother Superior discovered that both Maria and Agnes were missing, the police were already climbing the hill with medical personnel. They found Maria where Agnes had said she would be, her body broken but her heart still beating. They took her to the hospital in Prato, where doctors worked frantically to save her life. And this time, with Maria in a hospital bed covered in obvious signs of torture, with doctors demanding answers, with nurses calling the police, the authorities couldn't ignore what had happened. A full investigation was launched into St. Cecilia's Convent. The discoveries shocked even hardened police officers. They found the discipline chamber with its instruments of torture. They found medical supplies that had been used to treat injuries inflicted during punishments. They found detailed records Mother Superior had kept, documenting each punishment, each correction, each lesson taught to disobedient nuns. And they found Sister Francesca's body in the old cemetery, along with 2 other bodies that had been buried there over the past 5 years. Mother Superior Juliana was arrested and charged with murder, torture, and false imprisonment. Several other nuns who had participated in the abuse were arrested as well. Father Domenico faced charges of criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. The case dominated Italian newspapers for months, raising questions about oversight of religious institutions and the dangers of unchecked authority. The trial began in the spring of 1959. Sister Maria, still recovering from her injuries, testified about everything she had witnessed and experienced. Other nuns, finally freed from Mother Superior's control, came forward with their own horror stories. The prosecution presented medical evidence, photographs of injuries, expert testimony about the long-term psychological damage inflicted on the victims. Mother Superior showed no remorse. She sat in the defendant's chair with her back straight, her expression serene, as if she were attending Mass rather than her own murder trial. When given the chance to speak, she said only, "I did nothing wrong. I was preparing these women for heaven through holy suffering. If the world cannot understand that, then the world is lost." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Mother Superior Juliana was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life in prison. She died there in 1973, never once admitting that her actions were anything other than divinely inspired. Sister Maria survived, though she bore the physical and emotional scars of her ordeal for the rest of her life. The brand on her arm remained visible until the day she died at age 78. She never returned to religious life, never set foot in a church again. She spent years in therapy, working to process the trauma and rebuild some sense of normal life. In the decades that followed, she became an advocate for abuse survivors, particularly those who had suffered at the hands of religious institutions. She gave interviews, wrote a memoir, and worked with lawmakers to establish better oversight and protection for vulnerable people in isolated religious communities. St. Cecilia's Convent was closed permanently after the trial. The building stood empty for years before being converted into a museum dedicated to the victims of religious abuse. Today, visitors can walk through the corridors where Sister Maria once lived in terror, can see the discipline chamber where unspeakable acts occurred, and can visit the cemetery where innocent women were secretly buried. The case raised important questions that still resonate today. How could such abuse continue for so long without intervention? Why did people like Father Domenico choose to look the other way? How could a system that claims to be built on love and compassion produce such monstrous cruelty? And most importantly, how can we prevent similar tragedies from happening in the future? If this story has disturbed you, made you angry, or opened your eyes to the potential for abuse in closed religious communities, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true crime documentaries that shine light on stories that need to be told. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case and whether you think enough has been done to protect vulnerable people in religious institutions. Sister Maria's story is a reminder that evil can flourish anywhere, even in places dedicated to God. It's a reminder that authority without accountability leads to abuse. It's a reminder that silence in the face of injustice makes us all complicit. Her courage in escaping and testifying saved the lives of the women still trapped at St. Cecilia's and prevented countless future victims from suffering the same fate. The convent of horror is gone now, but its lessons remain. We must never assume that religious clothing or holy words automatically indicate goodness. We must listen when victims speak out, even when their stories seem unbelievable. We must investigate thoroughly when allegations arise, rather than deferring automatically to institutional authority. And we must never forget the women like Sister Maria who survived hell on earth and found the strength to ensure it never happened again. Before you go, hit that like button if you believe Sister Maria's story deserves to be remembered and shared. And make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the darkest corners of true crime history. Because these stories matter, these victims matter, and keeping their memories alive is how we honor their suffering and prevent history from repeating itself. The question that haunts everyone who studies this case is the simplest and the hardest to answer. How did Mother Superior Juliana transform from a woman who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience into a torturer and murderer? Psychiatric evaluations conducted after her arrest revealed a woman who genuinely believed she was doing God's work, that the pain she inflicted was a form of divine love, that breaking bodies was the pathway to saving souls. She showed all the signs of what psychologists now recognize as religious psychosis, combined with sadistic personality disorder, a lethal combination that allowed her to justify any cruelty as holy purpose. But Mother Superior didn't act alone. She created an entire system of control and fear that turned some nuns into accomplices and all of them into either victims or witnesses too terrified to intervene. She exploited the power structures inherent in religious life, the expectation of obedience to superiors, the tradition of mortification and penance, and the isolation of cloistered communities. She took things that were meant to foster spiritual growth and twisted them into tools of oppression. The aftermath of the St. Cecilia's scandal reverberated through religious communities across Italy and beyond. Many convents and monasteries implemented new safeguards, including regular independent inspections, better channels for reporting abuse, and limits on the authority of superiors. The Catholic Church, while slow to respond initially, eventually acknowledged that the isolation and lack of oversight that allowed Mother Superior Juliana to commit her crimes needed to be addressed. But change came too late for Sister Francesca and the other women buried in that cemetery. Too late for the nuns who spent years suffering in silence. Too late for Sister Agnes, who died of a heart attack just weeks after helping Maria escape, her body finally giving out after decades of stress and fear. The survivors carried invisible wounds that never fully healed, memories that couldn't be erased, trauma that shaped the rest of their lives. Sister Maria spent her final years in a small apartment in Florence, surrounded by books and photographs of the life she had built after escaping the convent. She never married, never had children, but she created a family of sorts among other survivors and advocates. On the anniversary of her escape each year, she would light a candle for Sister Francesca, Sister Agnes, and all the women who didn't survive Mother Superior's reign of terror. When interviewed by journalists in her later years, she was always asked the same question. Did she regret becoming a nun? Her answer never changed. I regret that my faith led me to a place of evil. I regret that I couldn't save everyone. But I don't regret the journey that made me who I am. The convent was supposed to bring me closer to God, but instead it taught me about the capacity for human cruelty and the strength of the human spirit to survive. That's a different kind of education than I expected, but perhaps it was the one I needed. The physical scars on her body told the story she carried with her always. The burn mark on her arm, the marks on her back from the leather strap, the damage to her hands from the chains. Each one was a reminder of what she had endured and what she had overcome. In the years following the trial, more details emerged about the depths of Mother Superior's depravity. During the investigation, police discovered journals in her private quarters that dated back 15 years. These weren't spiritual reflections or prayer diaries. They were detailed accounts of each punishment she had administered, written in clinical language that made the horror even more disturbing. She had documented which methods produced the most fear, which caused the most pain, which broke a person's spirit most effectively. She had been experimenting on the women under her care, refining her techniques of control and torture like a scientist perfecting a formula. One entry, dated 3 months before Maria's arrival, read, "Sister Francesca continues to resist correction. Traditional methods have failed to produce the necessary submission. Tomorrow I will try the water treatment combined with sensory deprivation. The combination of physical and psychological pressure should prove more effective. The goal is not punishment, but transformation. She must be broken completely before she can be rebuilt in the proper image of obedience." Reading these entries during the trial, the prosecutor had to pause several times to compose himself. This wasn't a woman who had lost her temper and acted in the heat of anger. This was calculated, methodical, planned cruelty carried out over years with increasing sophistication. Mother Superior had turned the convent into her own private laboratory of suffering, and the nuns were her unwilling test subjects. The prosecution also uncovered evidence that Mother Superior had been embezzling money from the convent's accounts for years. Donations intended for charity work, funds meant to maintain the building, money sent by families to support their daughters who had taken vows. All of it had been diverted into Mother Superior's personal accounts. She had accumulated a substantial fortune while the nuns under her care lived in poverty, eating meager meals and wearing threadbare habits. When asked what she planned to do with the money, she claimed it was being saved for God's work. Investigators found no evidence it had ever been used for anything except her own enrichment. This financial motive added another layer to understanding her crimes. It wasn't just religious psychosis driving her behavior. She had a practical reason to maintain absolute control over the convent and prevent any nun from leaving or speaking out. If word got out about the abuse, investigations would follow, and investigations would reveal her theft. Every woman she tortured into silence was protecting her financial scheme as well as her twisted spiritual vision. Sister Bernadette, one of the nuns who had assisted Mother Superior in carrying out punishments, testified at the trial in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony provided the most chilling insights into Mother Superior's mindset. She truly believed she was chosen by God for a special mission, Bernadette explained, her voice hollow. She said that the church had become too soft, that Vatican reforms were weakening the faith, that someone needed to preserve the old ways no matter how harsh they seemed. She convinced us that the suffering we inflicted was an act of love, that we were saving these women's souls even if we had to destroy their bodies. Bernadette broke down on the witness stand as she described her role in Sister Francesca's death. Mother Superior said Francesca was possessed, that the demon inside her needed to be driven out. We locked her in the discipline chamber, and Mother Superior worked on her for hours. The screaming was terrible, but Mother Superior said that was the demon resisting, that we had to keep going until it was cast out. When Francesca finally went silent, Mother Superior checked her pulse and said the demon had taken her rather than release her. She said we needed to bury her quickly and tell everyone she had been transferred. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Bernadette continued. I knew it was wrong. I knew we had killed her. But I was so afraid of Mother Superior, so convinced that questioning her was the same as questioning God, that I helped dig the grave. I helped carry the body. I kept the secret, and I've lived with that guilt every single day since. The psychological manipulation Mother Superior employed was textbook cult behavior, according to experts who analyzed the case. She had isolated the nuns from outside contact, created an environment of constant fear and uncertainty, positioned herself as the sole source of truth and authority, used sleep deprivation and physical stress to weaken resistance, and punished any attempt at independent thought or action. Many of the nuns who survived exhibited symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, actually defending Mother Superior's actions even after they were freed. Sister Helena, who had been locked in a windowless cell for 2 weeks, initially refused to testify against Mother Superior. When questioned by police, she insisted that her punishment had been justified, that she had been spiritually weak and needed correction. It took months of therapy and separation from the other nuns before she could begin to see her experience for what it had been. Even then, she struggled with conflicting feelings of loyalty to Mother Superior and horror at what had been done to her. This psychological complexity made the case particularly challenging for prosecutors. How do you explain to a jury that women who were beaten, tortured, and terrorized sometimes defended their abuser? How do you make them understand that the human mind develops coping mechanisms that can look like complicity but are actually survival strategies? The prosecution brought in expert witnesses to explain trauma bonding, learned helplessness, and the psychological effects of prolonged abuse in isolated environments. The defense tried to argue that Mother Superior was insane, that she couldn't be held responsible for actions committed during a psychotic break from reality. But the prosecution's psychiatric experts demolished this argument. Yes, Mother Superior showed signs of religious delusion and personality disorders, but she also demonstrated clear awareness of right and wrong. She had hidden her activities from outsiders, had threatened nuns with worse punishment if they spoke out, had maintained a facade of normalcy during Father Domenico's visits and interactions with benefactors. These were the actions of someone who knew she was doing something society would condemn and was actively working to conceal it. Mental illness might explain her motivations, but it didn't excuse her actions or remove her legal responsibility. One of the most powerful moments of the trial came when Sister Maria was cross-examined by the defense attorney. He tried to suggest that she had exaggerated her suffering, that her memory had been distorted by trauma, that perhaps the punishments hadn't been as severe as she described. Maria stood from the witness chair, unbuttoned the sleeve of her dress, and held out her arms so the entire courtroom could see the brand mark that Mother Superior had burned into her flesh. "Does this look exaggerated to you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Or these?" She turned to show the scars on her back, visible through the sheer fabric of her dress. "I carry the evidence of what happened to me on my body. I'll carry it until the day I die. And there are things that happened to me in that chamber that left no visible scars but damaged me just as deeply. So don't you dare suggest that I'm exaggerating or misremembering. I was there. I survived it. And I'm speaking for all the women who didn't survive, who are buried in that cemetery, who died alone and afraid and in terrible pain because of that woman sitting right there." She pointed at Mother Superior, who met her gaze without flinching. For a long moment, the two women stared at each other across the courtroom. The young woman whose life had been shattered, and the old woman who had shattered it. The survivor and the destroyer. The witness and the accused. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Finally, Mother Superior smiled. It was a small, cold smile that sent chills through everyone who saw it. "You were always weak, Sister Maria," she said quietly. "That's why you needed such strong correction. I was trying to save your immortal soul. I'm sorry you're too blind to see that." The judge immediately admonished her to remain silent unless asked a direct question, but the damage was done. That single exchange, that complete lack of remorse or understanding, sealed Mother Superior's fate in the eyes of the jury. This wasn't a woman who had made mistakes or lost her way. This was a woman who remained convinced of her righteousness even as she faced the consequences of her crimes. The verdict, when it came, was met with gasps of relief from the survivors in the courtroom. Several nuns wept openly. Sister Maria sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face pale but composed. She had done it. She had survived. She had testified. She had helped bring justice for Sister Francesca and all the others. The nightmare was finally truly over. But was it? Even as Mother Superior was led away in chains, even as the convent was closed and the survivors began trying to rebuild their lives, questions remained. How many other religious communities harbored similar abuse? How many victims suffered in silence, convinced that speaking out would be a betrayal of God? How many charismatic leaders exploited faith and devotion to serve their own twisted purposes? In the decades since the trial, numerous other cases have come to light. The Magdalene laundries in Ireland, where young women were imprisoned and forced into servitude, the industrial schools where children were subjected to horrific abuse by priests and nuns, The residential schools where indigenous children were torn from their families and brutalized in the name of Christian education. The pattern repeats across countries, denominations, and centuries. Authority without accountability, isolation without oversight, faith twisted into justification for cruelty. Sister Maria dedicated her post-convent life to ensuring that what happened at St. Cecilia's would never be forgotten and never be repeated. She worked with lawmakers to pass legislation requiring regular independent inspections of religious institutions. She established support groups for survivors of religious abuse. She spoke at universities and conferences about the warning signs of controlling environments and how to identify when legitimate spiritual discipline crosses the line into abuse. She also worked to change the culture of silence that had allowed Mother Superior's crimes to continue for so long. "We're taught from childhood to respect religious authority," she said in one interview. "We're taught that priests and nuns are holy, that convents and monasteries are places of peace and prayer, and most of them are, but some aren't. And we need to create a culture where questioning authority isn't seen as a lack of faith, where reporting abuse isn't seen as betrayal, where protecting victims is more important than protecting institutions." Her advocacy wasn't always welcome. The church was often resistant to outside oversight, arguing that it infringed on religious freedom. Conservative voices accused her of being anti-religious, of attacking faith itself rather than the individuals who had abused it. But she persisted, always careful to distinguish between legitimate religious practice and criminal behavior, disguised as religious discipline. "I'm not against monasteries or convents," she would explain patiently. "I'm not against discipline or structure or even penance. What I'm against is isolation that prevents victims from seeking help. I'm against authority figures who face no consequences for their actions. I'm against systems that prioritize institutional reputation over human suffering. That's not an attack on faith. That's a defense of human dignity." The survivors of St. Cecilia's followed different paths after the trial. Some, like Sister Maria, left religious life entirely and built secular existences. Others transferred to different convents, determined to live out their vows in healthier environments. A few struggled with addiction and mental health issues, the trauma too deep to overcome fully. Several never spoke publicly about their experiences, carrying the weight of those years in private silence. Sister Agnes's family established a memorial fund in her honor, supporting organizations that work to prevent abuse in religious settings. The fund's mission statement reads, "In memory of Sister Agnes, who gave her life to save another. May her courage inspire us to always choose protecting the vulnerable over protecting the powerful." The convent building itself stands as a monument to both horror and hope. The museum that now occupies the space doesn't shy away from the dark history. Visitors walk through the rooms where women suffered, see photographs of the survivors, read excerpts from Mother Superior's journals, and view the instruments of torture that were used. But the museum also tells stories of survival, resistance, and ultimately justice. It honors the victims while celebrating the courage of those who escaped and spoke out. Every year on the anniversary of the convent's closure, survivors and their families gather at the site for a memorial service. They light candles for those who died, share memories of those who survived, and recommit themselves to the work of preventing similar tragedies. Sister Maria attended every single one of these gatherings until her death in 2012. Even in her final year, when she was weak and ill, she insisted on being there. "This is where my real religious education happened," she said at her last memorial gathering, her voice thin but determined. "Not the education I came seeking, but the one I needed. I learned that evil can flourish anywhere, even in houses of God. I learned that silence protects abusers and destroys victims. I learned that courage sometimes means standing alone against everyone and everything you've been taught to trust. And I learned that survival, speaking truth, and seeking justice are their own forms of prayer." She died peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, surrounded by friends and fellow advocates. Her obituary was carried by newspapers around the world, and her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her advocacy work. The survivors of St. Cecilia's, who were still living, all attended, creating a final reunion of women bonded by shared trauma and shared triumph. At her request, Sister Maria was buried in a simple grave with a headstone that read, "Maria Vittoria, 1934 to 2012. She survived. She spoke. She changed the world." No religious titles, no lengthy epitaph, just the essential truth of her life after the convent. The case of St. Cecilia's Convent remains one of the most studied examples of institutional abuse in religious settings. It's examined in criminology courses, psychology classes, and theology programs. It serves as a case study in how charismatic authority can corrupt, how isolation enables abuse, and how institutional loyalty can blind people to obvious evil. It's also studied as an example of survivor resilience and the power of testimony to affect change. If you found this story both horrifying and important, you're not alone. Thousands of people have watched this documentary and felt the same conflicting emotions. Anger at what was done to these innocent women, admiration for Maria's courage, fear that similar abuse might be happening right now in places we don't know about, and determination to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our continuing coverage of true crime cases that matter. Cases that teach us important lessons about justice, accountability, and human nature. The legacy of St. Cecilia's extends beyond the specific individuals involved. It changed how many countries approach oversight of religious institutions. It led to reforms in how abuse allegations are investigated. It sparked conversations about the balance between religious freedom and the need to protect vulnerable people. It reminded the world that no institution, no matter how respected or how holy its mission, should be above scrutiny or immune from accountability. Mother Superior Juliana's final years in prison were marked by the same unshakable conviction that had characterized her reign at the convent. She never expressed remorse. She never acknowledged wrongdoing. According to prison records, she spent her days in prayer and wrote lengthy theological treatises arguing that suffering was the purest path to God. She tried to convert fellow inmates to her philosophy, with limited success. Most prisoners, even those guilty of terrible crimes themselves, were disturbed by her complete lack of empathy or moral understanding. She died in 1973 of a heart attack while attending a prison chapel service. Her last words, according to witnesses, were a prayer asking God to forgive those who had persecuted her for doing his work. Even in death, she remained convinced of her righteousness. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. Her family, shamed by her crimes, refused to claim it. The contrast between Mother Superior's lonely, unremembered death and Sister Maria's celebrated life says everything about which woman truly understood the meaning of faith, compassion, and service. One used religion as a weapon to control and destroy. The other emerged from religious trauma and dedicated herself to healing and protection. One died unrepentant and unmourned. The other died loved and remembered, her life a testament to the power of truth and the possibility of healing even after unimaginable suffering. Today, more than 60 years after Sister Maria escaped from St. Cecilia's Convent, her story continues to resonate. In an era when institutional abuse scandals regularly make headlines, when we're constantly discovering new cases of authority figures exploiting the vulnerable, the lessons of St. Cecilia's remain urgent and relevant. How do we balance respect for religious tradition with protection for those who might be suffering within those traditions? How do we encourage people to speak out while acknowledging how difficult and dangerous that speaking out can be? How do we create systems of accountability that actually work to prevent abuse, rather than simply responding after the damage is done? These are the questions that Sister Maria spent her life trying to answer. And while she made tremendous progress, while she helped create real change that saved real lives, she would be the first to say that the work isn't finished. There are still survivors suffering in silence. There are still institutions that prioritize reputation over responsibility. There are still authority figures who exploit their power and faithful people who are afraid to challenge them. So as we conclude this documentary about the convent of horror and the remarkable woman who survived it, remember that this isn't just history. This is an ongoing struggle. Every time you hear about abuse allegations and wonder whether to believe the victim or give the institution the benefit of the doubt, remember Sister Maria. Remember how many people dismissed her initial cries for help. Remember how Father Domenico chose loyalty to Mother Superior over concern for the suffering nuns. Remember how the police were reluctant to interfere in church matters even when presented with evidence of torture? And then make the choice that honors Sister Maria's courage in the memory of Sister Francesca and all the others who didn't survive. Believe the victims, demand accountability, insist on oversight. Never assume that religious clothing or institutional authority automatically indicates goodness. And always remember that protecting people is more important than protecting reputations. Thank you for watching this documentary. Please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this case and what lessons you think we should take from it. Your engagement helps ensure that stories like Sister Maria's reach more people, that these important conversations continue, and that the victims of St. Cecilia's Convent and countless other cases of institutional abuse are never forgotten. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into true crime stories that matter, stories that teach us about the darkest capabilities of human nature and the brightest examples of human courage. Because remembering is how we honor, speaking is how we heal, and learning is how we prevent history from repeating itself. Sister Maria's final interview, conducted just months before her death, ended with a question about whether she still believed in God after everything she had experienced. Her answer captured the complexity of her journey and the wisdom she had gained through suffering. "I don't believe in the God that Mother Superior claimed to serve," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. That God was cruel, petty, and sadistic. That God demanded suffering for its own sake. That God looked like Mother Superior herself, which should tell you everything about where that theology really came from. But do I believe in a God of compassion, justice, and love? A God who weeps over suffering rather than demands it? A God who sides with victims rather than abusers? Yes, I think I do. I think that God was with me in that discipline chamber, suffering alongside me. I think that God was in Sister Agnes when she found the courage to help me escape. I think that God is in every person who works to protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable. So perhaps my faith didn't die in that convent. Perhaps it was just refined, stripped of all the false teachings and institutional corruption, until only the essential truth remained. We are called to love and protect each other. Everything else is just human beings claiming divine authority for their own purposes. Those words spoken by a woman who had every reason to reject faith entirely, who had experienced religious devotion twisted into its most grotesque form, somehow capture the enduring power of Sister Maria's story. She refused to let her abusers define what faith meant. She refused to surrender her humanity or her hope, even when faced with inhuman cruelty. She survived, she spoke, and she changed the world. And that ultimately is why her story matters. Not just because it exposes the horrors that can occur when authority goes unchecked, though it certainly does that. Not just because it serves as a warning about the dangers of institutional insularity and the importance of accountability, though those lessons are crucial. But because it shows us that even in the darkest circumstances, even after the most devastating trauma, healing is possible, justice is possible, change is possible, hope is possible. Sister Maria proved it with her life, and every survivor of abuse who finds the courage to speak, every advocate who works to create change, every person who chooses to believe and support victims rather than defend institutions, continues proving it today. The convent of horror is closed. Mother Superior is dead, but the work of creating a world where such atrocities cannot happen, where victims are believed and protected, where justice prevails over institutional loyalty, continues. That work continues in your hands now. By watching this documentary, by engaging with this story, by choosing to remember rather than forget, you become part of the legacy that Sister Maria left behind. Honor her memory by never accepting that abuse is inevitable, by never believing that authority figures are above accountability, and by always standing with the vulnerable against the powerful. Thank you for staying until the end. Your attention honors Sister Maria's memory and the memory of all who suffered. Now go forth and make sure that this story and the lessons it teaches continue to spread, because silence enabled the horror at St. Cecilia's, and speaking, sharing, and remembering is how we ensure it never happens again.